The boy at the door. The heavy oak doors of the Ashbridge County Courthouse swung wide open, slamming against the walls with a force that made every head in the courtroom snap toward the entrance. The sharp crack echoed through the chamber, louder than the stifling hum of the ancient ceiling fans and the murmuring voices of attorneys and townsfolk. Judge Olivia Mather's gavel hovered in the air, mid-motion, her brow furrowing at the unexpected disruption. A boy stood there, small, disheveled, tears streaking through the dirt caked onto his cheeks. His sneakers were scuffed, his oversized t-shirt hung off his narrow frame, damp with sweat, and his breath came in desperate, ragged gasps. In his trembling hands, he clutched a crumpled newspaper so tightly that his fingers were bloodless, the edges of the paper worn thin from being handled over and over again. He didn't belong there, not in the polished world of lawyers and property disputes, not with his rawness and his wild-eyed desperation. But there he was, rooted to the spot, a fragile thing standing between the world he knew and the world he was about to break into. Please. His voice cracked as he stumbled forward, his sneakers squealing against the polished floor. Please, I need help. The murmurs rose again, a tide of whispers and curious stares washing over the boy. Sheriff Kenneth Dorsey, a man with a gut that stretched the limits of his belt, rose from his seat near the back. His eyes narrowed, and his mouth set into a thin, displeased line. "Son," the sheriff said, moving toward him, his boots clomping with exaggerated authority. "You can't." The boy dodged him, darting past the sheriff's outstretched arm, weaving between the rows of wooden benches like a rabbit fleeing a hawk. He slid to a stop just feet from the judge's bench, his chest heaving with sobs. "Order." Judge Mathers's voice rang out, her gavel cracking against the wood. "Enough of this. Who are you, child? What is the meaning of this disruption?" The boy wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing dirt into mud across his cheek. He lifted the crumpled newspaper, shaking it like a flag, as if the inked words could explain what his trembling lips could not. "They're taking my granddaddy," he said, voice wobbling but fierce. "They say he's crazy, but he's not. He's telling the truth. Please, Judge. Please." The words dropped like stones into the stillness that followed. The judge leaned forward, her fingers tightening around her gavel until her knuckles went white. "Your name," she said, her voice cool but curious. "What's your name, son?" The boy drew in a breath so sharp it whistled through his teeth. He straightened his back as best he could, his small chin lifting with defiance. "Isaiah," he said. "Isaiah Harlan." The courtroom froze. The judge's face paled, her grip on the gavel faltered, and for a split second, the calm, unflappable expression she wore like a mask cracked. Her fingers trembled, the weight of the name washing over her like cold water. Harlan. The name vibrated through the room, rippling through the gathered crowd, dredging up old memories, whispered stories, things buried so deep in the town's history that they had become myth. The judge's heart slammed against her ribs. She knew that name. Everyone in Ashbridge knew it. Harlan wasn't just a name. It was a ghost. "Bailiff," Judge Mathers said, her voice clipped and urgent. "Call 911. Now." The bailiff, an older man with gray at his temples, hesitated only for a heartbeat before rushing out into the hall to make the call. The murmurs swelled again, louder this time, hungry for answers. "Judge," Sheriff Dorsey asked, stepping closer to the bench, his suspicion masked with a thin layer of politeness. "Is there a threat?" Judge Mathers's gaze never left the boy. "We'll see." Isaiah clutched the newspaper tighter, his knuckles ghostly white. "You can't let them take him," he cried. "He didn't do nothing wrong. He saw something, and now they're trying to get rid of him." "What did he see, Isaiah?" the judge asked, her voice quieter now, almost gentle. Isaiah's throat bobbed, swallowing back another wave of tears. He uncrumpled the paper enough for the judge to see, his hand shaking so badly the newsprint rattled like dry leaves in the wind. The headline, bold and ominous. Read, Jeremiah Harlan's final warning. The truth they tried to bury. The judge's breath caught in her throat. Jeremiah Harlan. It had been more than 40 years since that name had graced her docket, and she had never forgotten it. How could she? Jeremiah Harlan had been the town's Cassandra, a man who had seen something so terrible, so damning, that no one could afford to believe him. Instead, they called him a drunk, a liar, a madman, and they locked him away. What truth, Isaiah? Judge Mathers asked, though the tremble in her voice betrayed her fear that she already knew. Isaiah shook his head, curls bouncing with the movement. He says he saw them. The men who took that man, James Whittaker, out into the woods all those years ago. Granddaddy saw what they did. They thought no one was watching, but he was there. The judge's stomach clenched. She knew the story. Everyone did. James Whittaker had vanished one summer night in 1983. They'd found his body weeks later in a shallow grave deep in the woods, hands bound, mouth stuffed with a dirty rag. But no one was ever charged. No investigation went past the first few days. Rumors swirled. It was a police matter, they said. Whittaker had crossed someone powerful, and Jeremiah Harlan had seen it all. The judge rose to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor, her hands pressed flat against the bench to steady herself. Isaiah, she said, her voice steadying, where is your grandfather now? They're taking him, Isaiah said, a sob shuddering through his thin frame. The state men came to the house this morning. Said he's dangerous. Said he's delusional. But he's not. Judge Mathers turned to the clerk. I want all case files on Jeremiah Harlan, 1983 and forward, on my desk in the next 10 minutes. The clerk blinked. All of them. All of them. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Judge, you can't seriously be thinking of entertaining. I'm thinking, Judge Mathers said, her voice sharp enough to slice the air, that if the system failed Jeremiah Harlan once, I will not let it fail him again. She turned back to Isaiah. Where are they taking him? Isaiah sniffled, wiping his nose on his sleeve. They said some special state hospital, outside the county, somewhere no one would find him. The judge's jaw tightened. Not if I have anything to say about it. The heavy air in the courtroom shifted, not lighter, but crackling with the kind of energy that heralds storms. For the first time in decades, the ghosts of Ashbridge stirred awake, and the truth they'd buried so carefully began clawing its way back to the surface. Isaiah stood taller, the crumpled newspaper still in his grip, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in a long time. Can you save him? He whispered. The judge gave him a long, steady look. I'm going to try. The weight of the past. The door to Judge Mathers' chambers creaked open, the hinges protesting like they hadn't been oiled in decades, fitting, given the ghosts that were about to walk in. The room was dim, the only light spilling in from the narrow window behind her desk, painting thin golden lines across the wood-paneled walls. Stacks of case files, some so old the edges had crumbled to dust, were piled on her desk like gravestones. Isaiah sat perched on the edge of a leather chair too big for him, his knees bouncing with nervous energy. His fingers fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, twisting the fabric until it wrinkled into knots. His eyes flicked from the window to the door and back again, as if expecting someone to burst through at any second and drag him out. Judge Olivia Mathers stood behind her desk, still in her black robe, but somehow the robe felt heavier now. Not a symbol of authority, but a shroud of guilt. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she ran her fingers over the oldest file in the stack, the name typed at the top in faded ink. Harlan, Jeremiah. The paper was yellowed, corners curled like ancient parchment. The edges were darker, as though they'd been singed by time itself. She hadn't seen this file since 1983, when she was still a fresh-faced assistant prosecutor, too eager to prove herself and too scared to ask the wrong questions. A name was scrawled in pen across the inside cover, beneath the typed case number. Sheriff Marcus Cooper, the man who ran the town back then, with a smile for the cameras and an iron fist for anyone who dared step out of line. Your granddaddy, Judge Mathers said quietly, her voice softer than Isaiah had heard it in the courtroom. He saw something, didn't he? Isaiah's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his voice coming out small but certain. He saw who took Mr. Whittaker. He knew their faces. Who were they? She asked, though a gnawing part of her feared she already knew. Isaiah hesitated, then shook his head. He never told me their names. He said if I knew, they'd come for me too. Judge Mather's stomach twisted. That was exactly the kind of thing Jeremiah would have said, not out of paranoia, but out of grim experience. And she realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Isaiah might already be on their radar just for showing up in court. "Where's your mom, Isaiah?" she asked. His face tightened, eyes lowering to the floor. She left, said she was tired of fighting ghosts. The words cut sharper than they should have. Fighting ghosts. That was exactly what Jeremiah had been doing his whole life. And now his grandson was picking up the fight, whether he wanted to or not. The judge's fingers tightened on the edge of the desk. The old files seemed to hum beneath her hands, whispering secrets that had been locked away for far too long. Names floated to the surface of her memory. Names of men who had stood in her courtroom wearing Sunday smiles and good suits, shaking hands at the church social while blood dried beneath their fingernails. Sheriff Marcus Cooper, Judge Henry Lorne, County Commissioner Ellis Warren, and her own name. Not because she had participated, but because she had stayed silent. She was young, ambitious, and terrified of standing in the way of men who decided whose lives mattered and whose didn't. Isaiah's fingers crinkled the newspaper in his lap again, the sound like leaves crunching underfoot. The headline still glared up at them. Jeremiah Harlan's final warning. He wrote this, Isaiah said softly. I found it under his bed after they took him. The article was handwritten, a desperate, rambling plea for anyone to listen. It detailed, in broken sentences and frantic handwriting, what Jeremiah saw that night. 3 men in dark clothes, pulling James Whittaker from his truck near the river. They'd beaten him until he couldn't stand, then dragged him into the woods. Jeremiah had followed, hiding behind trees, too scared to breathe. And he saw their faces when they pulled off their masks. Judge Mather's breath came slower, heavier, as the truth crawled back to life. Why didn't he go to the police back then? She asked, though she suspected the answer. Isaiah's smile was humorless. The police were the ones who did it. The judge sat down hard. The chair creaked under her weight. The memory was so clear now, her first year as a prosecutor, watching Jeremiah Harlan stand in front of the court, hands trembling, voice cracking with desperation. No one had believed him, because no one was allowed to believe him. Judge Henry Lorne had smiled from the bench, indulgent and patronizing, and asked Jeremiah if maybe he'd had too much to drink that night. He'd laughed. The whole courtroom had laughed, and Jeremiah had been branded a lunatic. The file she held now contained only a sliver of the truth. Evidence had gone missing. Reports altered. Testimonies rewritten until the official story was just another bedtime tale about a crazy old man seeing shadows in the dark. And she had stood there, saying nothing. We have to get him out, Isaiah said suddenly, his voice breaking through the fog of memory. Judge Mathers straightened. We will. How? The judge's fingers drummed the desk, mind racing. Calling the state hospital wouldn't be enough. Not with the county sheriff's office greasing the wheels to have Jeremiah committed before the sun set. They'd need legal leverage, something undeniable. And there was only one place left to find it. The evidence room. Down in the courthouse basement, beneath flickering fluorescent lights, was a room no one talked about, a vault where old case files, confiscated evidence, and documents that didn't fit the narrative were stuffed into unmarked boxes. If there was anything left, any proof that had survived decades of silence, it would be there. Come with me, Judge Mathers said, standing abruptly. "We don't have much time." Isaiah followed, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor as they made their way down the narrow stairwell at the back of the courthouse. The walls were lined with framed portraits of judges long dead, men whose eyes seemed to follow them as they descended. The door to the evidence room was locked, but Judge Mathers still had the key, a relic from a time when judges had unfettered access to everything beneath their courthouse. The key slid into the lock with a grinding sound, and the door creaked open, releasing the smell of old paper, mildew, and time. The room was cold, even in the summer heat, and lined with shelves that reached the ceiling. Boxes, some labeled, some not, filled every available space. The air felt heavy, like the past was pressing down on them. "Start looking," she said, grabbing a box from the nearest shelf. Isaiah didn't need to be told twice. They worked in silence, sifting through decades of forgotten cases, water-damaged files, and photographs faded to ghostly smudges. Judge Mather's hands shook as she flipped through pages, remembering the faces that had come through her court, some innocent, some guilty, all at the mercy of the system she had served so faithfully. Isaiah tugged on her sleeve. "Look." In his hands was a folder labeled Whitaker Investigation, the official file for the case that had started everything. The folder was thin, too thin, but tucked inside was something she hadn't expected to find. A photograph. It was grainy, black and white, taken from a distance. It showed 3 men standing at the edge of the woods, their faces turned away from the camera. But one of them, caught mid-turn, was unmistakable. Sheriff Marcus Cooper, the man who built this town's legacy on secrets and silence. Isaiah's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're gonna come after us now, aren't they?" Judge Mathers closed the folder, her fingers white-knuckled around its edges. "Let them." Whispers beneath the floorboards. The courthouse basement door slammed shut behind them, the heavy clang ringing in the air like a gavel striking wood. Judge Mathers leaned her weight against the cold cinder-block wall, her breathing ragged from the rush of adrenaline that had propelled them down there in the first place. Isaiah stood a few feet away, clutching the crinkled Whitaker Investigation file to his chest like it was a life raft in a storm. The air was colder here, not just from the underground chill, but from something deeper, something wrong. The kind of cold that lived in places where truth had been buried alive. "We can't stay down here long," Mathers said quietly, straightening her back and brushing the dust off her robe. "The courthouse isn't safe anymore." Isaiah's wide eyes darted toward the door. "You mean the sheriff's guys?" She hesitated before answering. "Not just the sheriff." The words hung in the air, heavier than the dampness clinging to the cement walls. Isaiah's grip tightened around the file, his knuckles pale. "Who else?" The judge took a slow, measured breath. "There are people in this town who've built their whole lives, their businesses, their careers, their families, on secrets. If we expose what really happened to James Whitaker, we're not just taking down the sheriff." Her voice softened. "We're tearing the rot out by the roots." Isaiah swallowed, his throat tight. "Good." The fierceness in his voice startled her, a flicker of Jeremiah's unbreakable spirit shining through the cracks of his 11-year-old fear. He wasn't just a scared kid anymore. He was his grandfather's grandson. Footsteps sounded overhead. The judge's head snapped up, her fingers instinctively wrapping around Isaiah's arm to pull them closer into the shadows. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, the kind of stride that carried confidence, ownership. Someone who knew they didn't need to run because this town already belonged to them. Isaiah held his breath, heart hammering in his ears. The footsteps stopped directly above them, near the entrance to the basement stairwell. There was a pause. Then the slow, metallic scrape of a boot turning on the wooden floor. Whoever was up there wasn't in a hurry. They were waiting, listening. Mather's grip on Isaiah tightened. After a long moment, the footsteps receded, fading back down the hall. Isaiah exhaled, sagging slightly against the judge. "Who was that?" She didn't answer, but in her mind, A name pulsed like a heartbeat. Sheriff Kenneth Dorsey. They had to move. The judge turned, scanning the shelves one last time. It wasn't just the Whitaker file they needed. There were other names connected to that night. Names that had been whispered in hushed voices at town meetings. Names that had appeared in quick, secret handshakes behind closed doors. She found what she was looking for halfway down the aisle. A battered cardboard box marked with a single word. COPR. Marcus Cooper, the former sheriff. The architect of the cover-up. Mathers set the box on the floor, flipping open the lid with trembling fingers. Folders, photographs, handwritten memos yellowed with age. Some edges burned where cigarette ash had dropped onto them. It was all there. A rotting time capsule of power and control. "Help me," she whispered. Isaiah knelt beside her, carefully sifting through the papers. Some were just old patrol reports, traffic citations, cover noise to make the file look legitimate. But buried between the bland paperwork were fragments of a darker story. A Polaroid, grainy but clear enough, showing 3 men standing beside James Whitaker's blood-stained truck. Their faces were turned away, but Isaiah recognized one of the figures from a photograph in his grandfather's house. "That's him," Isaiah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's Sheriff Cooper." Mathers' stomach twisted, but it was the paper clipped to the back of the photo that sent ice down her spine. It was a typed memo, dated the morning after Whitaker's disappearance. Subject: Cleanup of incident, Miller's Creek. Signed, Sheriff Marcus Cooper. Copies to H. Lorne, E. Warren, K. Dorsey. She froze. Judge Henry Lorne, County Commissioner Ellis Warren, and Sheriff Kenneth Dorsey. He wasn't just covering up for old friends. He was there. "Jesus," Mathers whispered. They were all in on it. Isaiah's hand shook as he held the memo, the reality sinking in. "That's why they called my granddaddy crazy. If he told, they all went down." The judge folded the memo carefully, tucking it into the inside pocket of her robe. "We need to get out of here." She stood, reaching for Isaiah's hand, when the basement door creaked open again. This time, the footsteps were faster, not measured, but purposeful. They were coming. "Move," Mathers hissed, dragging Isaiah behind her as they darted between the shelves. The dim light threw their shadows against the walls, grotesque and stretched. Isaiah's sneakers squeaked against the concrete, too loud in the silence. The footsteps descended the stairs. They reached the far corner of the room, where an old maintenance door led to the side alley. Mathers fumbled for the latch, her fingers slick with sweat. Isaiah pressed against her back, heart hammering. The footsteps were closer now. The latch finally gave, the door creaking open into the blinding afternoon sun. They spilled out into the alley, Isaiah stumbling on the uneven pavement. Mathers pulled him to his feet, slamming the door shut behind them. They didn't look back. They ran. They didn't stop until they reached the judge's car, parked behind the courthouse in her designated spot. The metal was hot under her hand as she yanked the door open and shoved Isaiah inside. The engine roared to life, the tires spitting gravel as they tore out of the lot. Isaiah twisted in his seat, looking back through the rear window. No one followed, but the sense of being watched clung to them like a second skin. "Where are we going?" Isaiah asked. Mathers' hands gripped the wheel so tight her knuckles shone white. "Somewhere they won't think to look." They drove in silence, the landscape of Ashbridge passing by in a blur of familiar landmarks turned ominous under the weight of what they now knew. Every gas station, every grocery store, every little brick building might have someone inside who had taken a piece of the lie and built a life on it. Mathers didn't slow until they reached the outskirts of town, where the old mill sat abandoned at the edge of the river. The building had been condemned years ago, but its rusted husk still stood, watching over the water like a skeleton sentinel. She killed the engine, and they sat in the quiet, the tick-tick-tick of the cooling car the only sound. Isaiah clutched the folder against his chest. Are we safe here? No, Mathers said honestly. But it's better than being in town. The judge turned in her seat, facing him fully. Listen to me, Isaiah. What we found, what your grandfather knew, it's not just evidence. It's the kind of truth that can break a town in half. Isaiah's jaw clenched. Good. She gave him a sad smile. It's also the kind of truth that gets people killed. The boy's hand shook, but his voice didn't. They already took my granddaddy. I'm not scared of them. The judge's heart cracked a little at the weight that sat on this child's shoulders, a weight grown men had run from for decades. She reached across the console, placing her hand over his. We're going to save him, she said softly, and we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly who's been running this town from the shadows. Isaiah's fingers curled around hers, small but strong. Together, he whispered. The wind stirred the long grass outside, rustling through the broken windows of the mill. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, its call echoing over the water. The truth was awake now, stretching its long limbs after decades of sleep, and it would not go back into the ground quietly. Blood beneath the roots. The mill groaned like a dying animal in the shifting afternoon wind. Its rusted beams creaked, each gust peeling away another sliver of flaking paint, exposing the raw metal skeleton beneath. Time had gutted this place, leaving nothing but broken glass, rotted timber, and the ghosts of workers who had walked these floors long before Ashbridge became a town that buried its secrets beneath polished smiles and freshly painted fences. Isaiah sat cross-legged on a splintered wooden pallet in the center of the mill's cavernous belly, the battered Whitaker file open on his lap. Dust caught in the sunlight slanting through shattered windows, making everything feel ancient, like they were sitting in a place preserved outside of time, a liminal space between past and present. Judge Mathers paced near the open doorway, her silhouette sharp against the pale afternoon sky. Her phone had rung 3 times since they'd arrived. Unknown number flashing each time. She hadn't answered. She knew exactly who it was. They know we found the file, she muttered, more to herself than Isaiah. Isaiah's fingers traced the edges of a black and white photograph tucked inside the file. The picture showed 3 men standing beside an old Ford pickup, its hood caked with dried mud. Even though the faces were turned away, Isaiah's gut told him the truth. These men. Isaiah's voice was quiet, careful, like saying it out loud might make it worse. They're the ones who killed Mr. Whitaker. Mathers stopped pacing. Yes. Isaiah's fingers curled into fists around the edges of the photo, crumpling it slightly. And my granddaddy saw them. The judge's expression softened. He didn't just see them, Isaiah. Her voice lowered. He knew who they were. The boy's eyes snapped up to hers. Why didn't he say their names? Why wouldn't he tell me? Mathers crouched beside him, her knee creaking from years on the bench. Because knowing the names doesn't just put you in danger, it makes you part of the story. She took the photo from his hand, smoothing it against her knee. Some stories get people killed. Isaiah's jaw clenched. They already tried. The judge couldn't argue with that. The silence was broken by the distant crunch of tires on gravel. Both of them froze. Mathers stood, moving quickly to the broken window. Across the overgrown lot, a black SUV had pulled onto the dirt road that led up to the mill. It sat idling, windows tinted too dark to see who was inside. The engine hummed low and steady, a predator waiting for its prey to show itself. Get down, she whispered sharply. Isaiah scrambled off the pallet, ducking behind the rusted remains of an old conveyor belt. Mathers stayed low, her fingers curling around her phone, but she didn't call anyone. Not yet. There was no one left to call. The SUV didn't move. For a long minute, the only sound was the wind whistling through broken panes of glass and the distant creak of the old water tower leaning over the riverbank. Then, without warning, the SUV's engine cut off. The silence was heavier than gunfire. Mathers' heart pounded in her chest, but her hand stayed steady. She scanned the edges of the mill. No other vehicles, no backup. Just this one. A door opened. A figure stepped out, wearing a pale gray suit too expensive for Ashbridge and too clean for the mill lot. His shoes were polished, black leather that gleamed in the dying sunlight. He wasn't local. No one in Ashbridge dressed like that unless they wanted to stand out. Mathers didn't recognize him. That worried her more than if she had. The man adjusted his tie, taking a few slow steps toward the mill before stopping. He didn't call out, didn't knock. He just stood there, waiting, his hands folded neatly in front of him like he had all the time in the world. Isaiah's breath was fast and shallow, but the judge gave him a look. Stay down. Stay quiet. Mathers stepped into the open doorway. You're trespassing, she said, her voice sharper than she felt. The man smiled, polite, polished, and completely devoid of warmth. Judge Mathers, he said. His voice was smooth, a practiced politician's cadence. I was hoping we could talk. She didn't move. You aren't from Ashbridge. No, the smile widened. But I represent certain interests here. The hair on her neck stood up, and those interests would be. The man's eyes flicked toward the mill, as though he could see through the rusted walls. Let's just say some things are best left forgotten. Mathers' fingers curled into fists at her sides. That's not how justice works. The man's smile didn't falter. That's not how power works. The air felt colder, the sun lower. I suggest, he continued, that you stop looking for things better left buried, for your sake, and for the boys. Mathers took a step forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath her heel. Are you threatening a child? The man's smile finally faded. I'm offering you a choice. And if I say no? The man turned, walking back to his SUV without answering. The vehicle roared back to life, tires spitting gravel as it reversed down the dirt road and disappeared into the trees. The judge stood there long after the sound faded, her fists trembling with fury. Isaiah's voice, small but fierce, cut the silence. Who was that? Mathers turned back to him, her face pale. Trouble. They didn't sleep that night. Mathers drove them to a small motel just outside county limits, the kind with flickering neon signs and cigarette burns in the comforters. The clerk didn't ask for ID, just took cash and handed over a metal key on a plastic tag. Isaiah sat on the edge of the bed, the file still clutched to his chest, like armor. Mathers stared at her phone, scrolling through names, people she used to trust, colleagues, even old friends. One by one, she realized she couldn't call any of them. The rot ran too deep. Why are they so scared? Isaiah asked softly. It's just the truth. The judge's smile was tired. The truth is the most dangerous thing in the world. Isaiah lay back, staring at the stained ceiling tiles. Do you think they'll hurt my granddaddy? Mathers didn't answer right away. They're afraid of him. That's why they want him locked away. The boy's jaw clenched. He didn't do anything wrong. No, Mathers said. He just saw. Outside, headlights flashed across the window. A car passing too slow for comfort. Mathers stood, moving to the door, her hand resting on the knob. She waited until the car was gone before letting out a breath. We'll get him out, she said softly. Isaiah's voice was small, almost a whisper. How? The judge looked at the battered file on the bedspread, the photos, the memo, the pieces of a puzzle that had cost people their lives. By shining the biggest light we can. The next morning, they stood in front of the local newspaper office, a squat brick building with a faded sign, its windows filled with flyers for church potlucks and community bake sales. The editor, a wiry woman named Marta Cruz, stood just inside the door, her arms crossed over her chest. This is suicide, she said flatly. Printing the truth? Mathers asked. Since when is that suicide? Marta's eyes flicked to Isaiah, standing beside her, since Ashbridge decided the truth was optional. Mathers held up the photo and the memo, placing them on the counter between them. You've got proof now. Real proof. Marta's expression didn't soften. They'll bury this paper. They'll come for me. Mather's voice lowered. They already came for a child. Marta's shoulders stiffened. Then, slowly, she reached for the papers. Her hands trembled slightly, but she took them anyway. I'll print it, she said. But you better get that boy somewhere safe. Isaiah straightened. I'm not hiding. Marta gave him a small, sad smile. That's what your granddaddy said too. The door swung shut behind them, the bell jangling one last time. The sun felt brighter, harsher. The world held its breath. The truth was finally out. But the fight was just beginning. The town that ate its own. The first shot shattered the window of the Ashbridge Gazette at 3:17 a.m. The crack of the gunshot echoed down Main Street, bouncing off brick facades and empty sidewalks, scattering pigeons from the awning of the hardware store. Glass rained down onto the pavement, sparkling in the streetlights like frost. Inside, Marta Cruz sat bolt upright, her heart punching against her ribs so hard it hurt. She didn't scream. She'd known this was coming. The truth had gone to print. It wasn't a long article, just 600 words, accompanied by a grainy photo of Sheriff Marcus Cooper and a scanned copy of the memo with Dorsey's name glaring at the bottom. But it was enough. More than enough. The headline burned like a brand across the front page. CTRGitas and silence. The truth behind TAO way to take me order. The paper had hit newsstands just before midnight, delivered to a few key locations around town before Marta locked the doors and settled into her office chair. She knew the phones would ring by morning. She knew there'd be threats, cancellations, people spitting on her name in the streets. She hadn't expected the gunshot. The bullet hadn't hit her, but it had been a message, clear and simple. Stop. Or next time. We don't miss. The press was still running in the back, clunking and whirring like an old man coughing up phlegm. It was an ancient machine, probably older than Marta herself, but it had just printed the most important edition in the town's history. She stood, brushing glass off her lap, and walked to the broken window. The street was empty. No car, no figure lurking in the shadows. Just silence, vast and yawning, waiting to see what would happen next. The storm was coming, but she wasn't going to stop. 10 miles outside of town, in a rundown motel, Isaiah and Judge Mathers sat in silence. Isaiah's knees were pulled up to his chest, his chin resting on them, the damp motel blanket draped over his shoulders. His eyes were locked on the small, flickering TV in the corner, some 24-hour news channel, the volume low, just a whisper of talking heads. Mathers sat on the bed opposite him, a legal pad balanced on her lap, a pen tapping rhythmically against the paper. She hadn't written anything in over an hour. There was nothing left to write. They were waiting. When the story hit, it would either break the dam or bring the hammer down on both of them. The motel room felt like a bunker. Faded wallpaper peeling at the corners, a single lamp buzzing with a failing bulb, the scent of mildew mingling with stale cigarette smoke. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for her car and a battered old pickup whose owner had been asleep since they arrived. Isaiah hadn't said much since they left Marta's office. The weight of it all, the violence, the fear, the truth they'd dug up, had settled on his shoulders like a lid blanket. Mathers could see the fight flickering in his eyes, but also the exhaustion, the kind that comes when you're too young to understand why the world wants you silenced. I should have run when I had the chance, Mathers muttered, more to herself than to him. Isaiah turned his head slightly, his voice soft but clear. Why didn't you? She didn't have an answer. Or maybe she did, but it hurt too much to say out loud. Because running was what cowards did. And she'd already been a coward once. 30 years ago, when she watched Jeremiah Harlan stand alone in her courtroom, begging for someone to believe him. She wasn't going to leave his grandson standing alone too. The motel phone rang. Both of them froze. Mathers crossed the room, picking up the receiver with slow, deliberate fingers. Hello. There was silence. Then, a low, rasping breath. "We see you." The line went dead. 6:42 a.m. The first calls started hitting the sheriff's office. The phones rang off the hook, each caller demanding answers, some shouting, some crying, some too stunned to do more than mumble disbelieving words into the receiver. Sheriff Dorsey sat at his desk, the morning paper spread before him, the headline glaring up like a personal insult. His hand shook as he lit a cigarette, the lighter's tiny flame reflecting in his sweat-slicked forehead. He was a man who had spent decades learning how to control people, with charm, with threats, with favors quietly exchanged behind closed doors. But now, with every ringing phone, every whispered conversation outside his office door, that control slipped further from his fingers. His door opened without a knock. Helen Whittaker, the town's district attorney, strode in, her face pale and tight, her hair pulled back so severely it seemed to pull her skin taut. She tossed a copy of the Gazette onto his desk. "What the hell did you do?" she hissed. Dorsey took a drag from his cigarette, the smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling. "What I had to. We had a deal," Helen snapped. "This was supposed to stay buried." "Deals change." Dorsey's smile was thin, humorless. "Besides, it's not my name in that article." Her fists curled at her sides. "You think this doesn't touch me? I signed off on every psychiatric commitment Jeremiah Harlan ever had." Dorsey's eyes narrowed. "Then maybe you should have buried him deeper." Helen's breath caught, her face paling further. "You think they're going to let us walk away from this? You think the governor's office won't come down here? We're done, Ken." The sheriff snubbed out his cigarette, grinding it into the ashtray. "Not if they can't find anyone to talk." Helen stepped back, realization dawning in her eyes. "You're not serious." He stood, looming over her. "We've come too far to let some judge and a kid burn it all down." At 8:03 a.m., the first reporters arrived. They came in dusty sedans and rental cars, camera crews tumbling out onto the sidewalks in front of the courthouse, setting up tripods and adjusting microphones. The story had spread beyond Ashbridge, picked up by regional outlets, then national ones, the kind of story that smelled like rot and power and small-town corruption. Isaiah stood behind the thin curtain of the motel window, peeking out at the empty lot. His stomach knotted with each passing minute. "Are we going to jail?" he asked quietly. Mathers didn't look up from the phone, where she was scrolling through texts from reporters, from her former law school classmates, even from a state senator she hadn't spoken to in 15 years. "No," she said, though the word felt like a wish more than a promise. Isaiah's voice was quieter still. "Are they going to kill us?" Mathers looked up, her expression softening. "They've already tried." Isaiah swallowed hard. What if they don't stop this time? The judge crossed the room, kneeling beside him so they were eye to eye. "Listen to me," she said, her voice low and firm. "They're scared. People like them. They only know how to control the truth by hiding it. Now, everyone's looking at them. They don't get to hide anymore." Isaiah's lower lip trembled. "But what if they hurt Granddaddy?" Her hand rested on his shoulder. "Then we make sure the whole world knows their names." At that exact moment, inside a locked room at Ashbridge State Psychiatric Hospital, Jeremiah Harlan sat alone. His hands rested on the scared wooden table, his wrists chafed from the too tight restraints they'd removed just an hour ago. The morning paper lay before him, slipped to him by a sympathetic nurse who remembered the story her own father used to tell. The headline stared back at him. "CURDs and silence. The truth behind Tao Waikatekior Nimurdr." For the first time in decades, Jeremiah Harlan smiled. The day Ashbridge fell. The air in Ashbridge had a strange taste that morning. Sharp, metallic, like the sky itself was bracing for blood. It was a town that had long learned to choke on its secrets, swallowing them whole until they sat like stones in the belly. But the weight had shifted overnight, and now the ground itself seemed to vibrate, a hum of something ancient and angry pushing up from beneath the sidewalks, through the courthouse steps, into every cracked window and rotting floorboard. The storm was here. Isaiah stood in front of the motel's bathroom mirror, the tips of his fingers tracing the faint bruise along his ribs, a reminder of the men who had tried to scare him silent. The bruises had started to fade, but the lesson they tried to teach him hadn't, except they'd gotten it backwards. They wanted him to fear the truth. All they'd done was teach him how much it was worth. He heard Judge Mathers pacing outside, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low but sharp. Isaiah knew she was talking to reporters again. They'd called all night, each one hungrier than the last. For the first time, Ashbridge wasn't just a dot on a map. It was a story, and stories didn't go away when the sun rose. They only got louder. Isaiah stepped into the main room just as Mathers hung up. She ran a hand through her hair, the perfect judge's bun long gone, replaced by loose strands that made her look more human than he'd ever seen. "They want you," she said softly. Isaiah's heart kicked against his chest. "Me. They want to talk to the boy who stood up in court." She forced a smile. The boy who stood for the truth. He shifted from foot to foot, fingers curling into the hem of his shirt. "I just want my granddaddy back." Her smile faded. "We're going to make that happen. Today." There was a knock on the door, 3 sharp raps that sent both their hearts into their throats. Mathers moved first, sliding the chain across before cracking the door an inch. Marta Cruz stood outside, her face pale, her hair pulled into a messy ponytail. Her fingers clutched a bundle of newspapers so tight the edges had crumpled. "They shot my window last night," she said, her voice flat. "Thought you'd want to know." Mathers opened the door wider, ushering her in. Isaiah sat back down on the edge of the bed, watching the 2 women silently. Marta tossed the papers onto the table. The headlines stared up at them. Secrets and silence. The truth behind the Whitaker murder. Isaiah had read it twice already. It was strange, seeing his grandfather's name printed so bold, no longer whispered at the edges of conversations, but carved into the record, undeniable. Marta lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. "Phones didn't stop ringing," she said. "Half the town's furious, half scared, and there's about a dozen people trying to figure out how fast they can pack and leave." "Good," Mathers said. Marta took a long drag, smoke curling through the air. "They're gonna come for you both. You know that, right? It's not just the sheriff anymore. This whole damn town's built on this lie." Isaiah's stomach twisted, but his voice was steady. "Let them come." The boy was so much like Jeremiah it hurt. The courthouse lawn was crowded by noon. Reporters stood in clusters, adjusting cameras and microphones, their vans parked haphazardly along the curb. Locals leaned against fences and pickup trucks, their arms crossed, eyes narrowed, caught somewhere between curiosity and fear. There was no normal day anymore, just before and after. Isaiah stood at the edge of the lawn, Mathers' hand resting on his shoulder, a gentle anchor. The sun felt too bright, the air too hot, but Isaiah didn't move. From the far side of the lawn, Sheriff Dorsey appeared. He wasn't wearing his uniform. Instead, he wore dark jeans and a worn denim jacket, his badge clipped to his belt like an afterthought. He walked with the slow, heavy step of a man who knew the noose was already around his neck. The only question was how tight it would get before the drop. Behind him, 2 deputies flanked the entrance to the courthouse. His deputies, the ones who had dragged Jeremiah Harlan from his home. Their eyes darted toward the cameras, but neither spoke. Dorsey stopped in front of Isaiah. The crowd quieted. The 2 stood eye to eye. A boy barely past 10 and a sheriff who had ruled this town for longer than Isaiah had been alive. And yet, it was the boy who stood taller. "You think you've done something special." Dorsey's voice was low, just for Isaiah, though the cameras caught the shape of his mouth. "You think you're gonna change anything." Isaiah's voice was clear. "I think the truth already did." Dorsey's face darkened. "This town doesn't belong to you." Isaiah took a step forward. "It doesn't belong to you either." For a moment, it seemed like the sheriff might strike him. His fists curled, his jaw tight. But there were too many cameras, too many eyes. The world was watching now, and the shadows where men like Dorsey hid were shrinking. He turned without a word and walked back into the courthouse. At 2:45 p.m., a state car pulled up to Ashbridge State Psychiatric Hospital. The doors opened, and two men in dark suits stepped out, state investigators, summoned by the governor's office after the story broke. Their faces were unreadable behind their sunglasses, but the paperwork they carried was anything but. The commitment order for Jeremiah Harlan was vacated, nullified with a sweep of the governor's pen. They walked through the hospital doors, past nervous nurses and silent orderlies, until they reached the room where Jeremiah sat, hands folded on the table. "You're free to go, Mr. Harlan." Jeremiah blinked once, twice, before a slow smile spread across his weathered face. "Took you long enough." At 3:17 p.m., Isaiah saw his grandfather for the first time in months. The hospital's front doors opened, and there he was, thinner than Isaiah remembered, his hair whiter, his shoulders a little stooped, but the fire in his eyes was the same. "Granddaddy." Isaiah's voice cracked as he ran, feet pounding across the pavement, sneakers slapping against the concrete. Jeremiah caught him, his arms strong despite the weight they carried. Isaiah buried his face in his grandfather's chest, and for a moment the rest of the world disappeared. "You did it, boy," Jeremiah whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You did what they tried to stop me from doing." Isaiah looked up, tears cutting paths down his face. "We did it together." Mathers stood a few feet away, watching them, her throat tight. For all her years behind the bench, for all the decisions she'd made, none had ever felt as important as this, the moment a family was made whole again. For the first time in decades, Jeremiah Harlan stood a free man on Ashbridge soil. By nightfall, the sheriff's office was empty. Dorsey's desk sat bare, the drawers cleaned out, the nameplate gone. A resignation letter, hastily scrawled and unsigned, sat on the blotter. The lights in the courthouse were dark. The next morning, the governor announced a full investigation into Ashbridge law enforcement and the county court system. Subpoenas would follow. Careers would end. The roots of the town had been rotted for decades. Now, they were being torn out. But for Isaiah, all that mattered was this: Jeremiah was home. That night, Isaiah lay in bed, his grandfather's hand resting gently on his shoulder as they both stared at the ceiling. The world outside was still broken, but inside this house that had held so much pain, there was finally peace. "Think they'll ever stop being mad at us?" Isaiah whispered. Jeremiah chuckled softly. "Maybe. But the truth's worth it, even if they don't." Isaiah smiled, his eyes drifting closed. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of the dark.